Hello math students. Today's video is lesson 3.1 factoring review. Before I get into the factoring, I want to review over how to multiply two binomials. So if I have x plus 2 times 3x minus 7, there's a few different ways we can do this. I'm going to do this using a box method. So I'm going to draw this box, and then on the top and the side, I am going to put each of the terms from each of these binomials. So I'm going to put an x on top plus 2. On the side, I'm going to put 3x minus 7. When I go to multiply these now, I'm going to look at each box individually. So I would look right here for this first box. I'm going to take x times 3. So I have 1 times 3 is 3. X times x is x squared. For the next box, over here, I'm going to multiply the 3x and the 2. So 3 times 2 is 6. And then I only have just the single x. If I come down to this box down here, I'm going to go 1 times negative 7 is negative 7. And then I am left with an x. And then for my final box, I am going to take the 2 and the negative 7 and multiply it, which gives me negative 14. For my answer to this multiplication, I'm just going to go and add together everything that's in the box. So 3x squared does not have any like terms. On this diagonal, though, I've got the 6 and the negative 7. So I'm going to add the 6 and the negative 7. 6 plus negative 7 is negative 1. And then I'm going to keep the x's the same. And then finally, I've got negative 14. So this is my answer when I am multiplying these two binomials. When we're factoring, what we're doing is I give you just the multiplied out form, and I need to figure out what are those factors in the parentheses. When we're factoring a quadratic, so quadratic is anything in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. The first thing that I want to always do is look for two numbers that when I multiply them together, give me a times c. So a is your first, c is your last, and then when I add them together, it gives me the middle. This first example is pretty easy because my a is just a 1. So I'm going to start by looking for two numbers that when I multiply them together, give me a negative 12 because I have 1 times negative 12. But then those same two numbers, when I add them together, need to equal 4. So I'm going to start by listing numbers that multiply to give me 12 or factors of 12. I always am going to have 1 and the number itself. And then I'm just going to go through and try and divide 12 by different numbers. So if I go 12 divided by 2, it gives me a 6. 12 divided by 3 is equal to 4. And then if I go to 4, I already have that on my list. So these are all of the numbers that multiply to 12. However, I have to multiply to a negative 12. But I'm adding to a positive 4. That means that my bigger number is positive, my smaller number is negative. So these are actually the factors that I'm going to look at. And I'm going to look and see what happens if I add them together. If I go negative 1 plus 12, that's equal to negative 11, so that doesn't work. But if I go negative 2 plus 6, negative 2 plus 6 is equal to 4. Negative 2 times 6 is equal to negative 12. Now that I've done this, I'm going to take this box method that I just did for multiplying, and I'm going to use it to help me factor. If you notice when I was multiplying, the 3x squared in the top left is the 3x squared in my answer. The negative 14 in the bottom right is the negative 14 for my answer. And then that 6 and negative 7 is what I add together to give me that negative 1. So when I make the box here, my top left is just going to be this x squared from my original question. The bottom right is going to be the negative 12 from the original. But for my other two spots, if you remember, the negative 1 on the previous question was what I got when I added together the 6 and the negative 7. In this question, the 4 is what I get when I add together the 2 and the 6. So I'm going to put a negative 2x in one box and a 6x in another. So now all I need to do is figure out what do I have in these 4 spots on this box, and that'll give me my factors. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to look at each row and column separately. So I'm going to start with this first column right here. I want to know what is the biggest number that I can divide both 1 and 6 by. Well, the only things I can divide 1 by is just 1. So I'm going to bring up that 1. I then am going to look at my x's. Because I have an x squared on top and an x on bottom, I'm going to bring one of the x's up. I'm going to come over now to this next row, or this next column. I'm going to look and see, well, what's the biggest thing I can divide both 2 and 12 by? Well, 2 I can divide it by 1 and 2. 12 I've got 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. The biggest number that's in both of those lists is a 2. So I'm going to bring the 2 up. But I have some negatives. The way that we decide whether we're going to do a positive or a negative is I'm going to look at which of these two pieces has the x with the biggest exponent. It's the top one. Since the top one's negative, I'm going to bring a negative up. And now I'm going to do this exact same thing for both of these rows. So I'm going to look at this top row. I want to know the biggest number I can divide both 1 and 2 by. It's just a 1. And then both of them have at least one x, so I'm going to pull out an x. I have this negative 2, but because the x squared is bigger than the x, and because 1x squared is positive, I'm going to keep a positive. And so it's just a plus 1 there. Last thing is I'm going to do this bottom row. So I want to know the biggest thing I can divide both 6 and 12 by. 6, I've got 1 and 6, and then 2 and 3. The biggest number that I have in both of these lists is 6, and so I'm going to bring over this 6. Because the x to the 1 is a bigger exponent than the negative 12, because the negative 12 doesn't have an x, I'm going to bring out a positive 6 because the 6x is positive. So now my final answer here is just x minus 2 times x plus 6. One thing we can notice on here is that this negative 2 and this negative 2 are the same. This 6 and this 6 are the same. So because the 1 in front of the x squared, or the number in front of the x squared is a 1, I could have completely skipped everything that we just did right here with a box. I could have skipped all of that and gone straight to my answer. Put the x minus 2 in one parentheses, x plus 6 in the other parentheses. But this only works if the number in front of x squared is a 1. So let's go and look and see what happens if that number is not equal to 1. So on number 2, I want to factor 7x squared plus 11x minus 6. The way that I am going to do this is I am going to start by finding two numbers that when I multiply them together equal 7 times negative 6, which is equal to negative 42. And then when I add them together is equal to 11. So I'm going to start by listing out factors of 42. So I always have 1 and the number itself. And then I'm going to just go and try and divide 42 by different numbers. So if I go 42 divided by 2, that gives me a 21. 42 divided by 3 is 14. I can't divide 42 by 4 or 5, but 42 divided by 6 is 7. And then I already have 7 on my list. Because 42 is negative and this 11 is positive, that means that my smaller number has to be negative. I'm going to go and make my box. I'm going to put the 7x squared on the top left, negative 6 on the bottom right. Before I do that though, so I've got my box, I need to figure out what are these other two numbers going to be. I have my factors. I'm going to try and add them together. Negative 1 plus 42 is not equal to 11. Negative 2 plus 21 is not equal to 11. But negative 3 plus 14 is equal to 11. So those are the numbers that I'm going to put here. I'm going to put a negative 3x and a 14x. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing that we did on number 1. So I'm going to take the first column. I'm going to see what is the biggest number that I can divide both a 7 and a 14 by. Well, 7 is just 7 times 1. 14 is 1 times 14 and 2 times 7. So my biggest number is a 7. They both have x, so I'm going to bring up an x. The biggest number I can divide both 3 and 6 by is a 3. But because this top box is negative, it's going to be a negative 3. When I go to the top row, I'm going to look at the biggest number I can divide both 7 and 3 by. It's going to be a 1. And they both have at least one x, so I'm going to bring out that x. And then for the bottom row, 14 and 6, the biggest number I can divide them both by is a 2. So my final answer would be 7x minus 3 times x plus 2. For the next 6 problems, I'm not going to work through them in this video, but I'm going to go and show you them worked out, and you can either go and copy that down or you can use it to check your work for 3 through 8.